welcome everybody to Creative Mornings Charlottesville. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Jeremy Stern. I'm the host of Creative Mornings Charlottesville. And if you haven't been here before, it is a international monthly breakfast lecture series with 243-ish chapters across the world. And basically every month, everyone in all those chapters finds someone to speak on one unified theme across the world and just share their creative practice or their journey or just what they've been thinking about recently to their local community. And so this month's theme is thread. The theme is always chosen by one of the chapters. Try to be more out of the way. And so this was chosen by the Derby chapter in the UK. And I'm going to briefly thank our sponsors. And so first, the global sponsor sponsoring all of those 238 cities is Adobe. Adobe has been a global partner in the past, and they've just repledged to fund Creative Mornings for a while, which is really exciting. And they had the original founder of Creative Mornings come up at their big Adobe Max conference and talk about Creative Mornings to that audience. So great for them to help boost the visibility of this and also help fund the people that help run the infrastructure that lets us do this here. More locally, I want to thank UVA Arts, New City Arts, and the Fralin Museum of Art at the University of Virginia. And special focus today on New City Arts, who are hosting us here in their welcome gallery. Thank you very much, New City Arts. And so to let you know about all the art that is around us right now, I'm going to pass it to Tori Cherry.
Hi everybody, I'm Tori. You are all now sitting inside of The Value of Dirt by Audrey Jefferson, who is a UVA fifth year on-spot fellow in the studio art department. All of these works are up for trade. So instead of trading for monetary money, she's opening up the paintings to other people in exchange for something that they find valuable. So if you want to trade something or offer something, you can, there's title sheets up in the front, maybe they're kind of hidden, with a QR code where you can do that in form, and today is the last day to do that, so get it in if you see anything.
And after the talk, if you didn't get a chance, it continues behind this giant piece. There's more stuff on that back wall, so go check that out after. And Maureen Brondike.
Thank you all for being here. I turned on the air conditioning so that hopefully it's a little bit cooler in here, but don't want to leave the door open so you can keep hearing all of us up here. I just wanted to mention that at the end of every year we do a big fundraising campaign to raise $30,000 for all of our programs for artists, including the space, the exhibitions in the space. It goes towards things like rent, keeping these lights on, running the air conditioning. And this year, in order to prioritize rest for staff and not fill your inboxes around Christmas and New Year's, we're moving that up to Giving Tuesday. So we've raised a $15,000 community pool match. And we are trying to raise $15,000 between now and Giving Tuesday. And we are giving away a set of artwork by 10 local artists to everyone who gives no matter the amount. You can start giving anytime, and the QR code is up there. More to come, but really glad you all are here, and just wanted to mention.
And I know the QR code is very tiny and kind of behind me, so we will also send out all these links later. So another thing, in addition to all of the live events that happen across the world, is since the pandemic, when Creative Mornings moved to a virtual format for a few years, they decided to keep that going and also offer what they call field trips, which are these style of talk, but run virtually, available to attendance by anyone globally. And the official tagline they say to read are that they're hosted by people like you from our global community. So this month, that's more literal because there's going to be one next week from Laura Lee Gullidge, who's here. And so I want to let Laura Lee talk about hers.
It's my first field trip.
And I'm really nervous about it. So I was like, oh, we should invite our local folks, even though we're in person, but. So we're gonna talk on making a self-care plan, which high five past tense me for lining this up for this moment, because I feel like we could use a little check-in, tune-up. So I'll be walking through making an 8-point self-care plan, which touches on things like identifying needs and boundaries and smuggling compassion when you don't really have compassion to care for yourself, and involving community. I'm just really excited about sharing it because I've been doing it for the past year with teens at different libraries, and so they've helped me hone it because they're sassy. So you're invited to join us. I hope that it's helpful and inspiring.
Thank you.
Oh, it's Wednesday. Wednesday at 9 a.m. for early birds online.
Thank you. And same deal where there's a very tiny QR code you may or may not be able to scan, but if you go to creativemornings.com/fieldtrips, you can see it. If you saw our email that we sent about registering for this event, it's at the bottom. And again, I can send another email with links. Okay, finishing up thanks. Thanks as always to Ian for the videography and Corbin for the photography. If you ever miss an event, or if this is your first event and you wonder what we've done in the past, there are videos of most of our previous talks on our website, all of them this year, courtesy of Ian. There's also photos on most of the event pages and on Flickr, again this year, all thanks to Corbin, so thank you both. If you all would like to volunteer, reach out to me at Charlottesville at CreativeMornings.com or via our Instagram. We are always looking for people to help out. If you are better at social media than me, would love for someone to help with that. If you have ideas for where to hold events, ideas for speakers, just generally reach out. I love to hear from you all. I'll even call it specifically, I think a few people have been suggesting this month's speaker, but PK Ross, who was our speaker 2 months ago, specifically said, you know who would be a great speaker is Some. So please give me recommendations because it helps us bring great people to talk to you. And last slide, bring a friend, make a friend. The kind of top ways people learn about Creative Mornings is either a friend of theirs is speaking or a friend of theirs attended and told their friends about it. So if you have a good time, come back and bring friends with you next time. I'll say now, we're gonna take December off because the third Friday in December is very close to when people are just gonna be traveling for holidays anyway. So we're gonna take next month off, but we'll be back in January and hopefully most of next year. So be on the lookout, sign up for our email list, or look on Instagram for our January speaker announcement. Okay. So with that, I am going to read Some's bio. So Some Louis is a Charlottesville-based conceptual artist investigating concepts of memory, home, family, and identity through the rituals of mundane occurrences and observations. She explores these concepts through a variety of media and methods, most frequently installation, embroidery on found and antique household textiles, minimal drawing on found papers, and performance on video. In her most recent visual work, she explores memory of a childhood in the Caribbean through common gestures of daily activities and considers the connection these routines held in building a sense of home, of self, home, and connection to one's family and ancestors. Through drawing and embroidery on found materials with aesthetic and personal historical relevance, she attempts to record these simple memories that have remained with her over time. Some holds a BA in studio art and art history from Wellesley College and is an active participant in a number of Charlottesville creative projects. She has completed residencies at New City Arts, 2nd Street Gallery, and McGuffey Art Center. She also recently joined McGuffey Art Center as a member and holds an active studio practice there. So join me in welcoming Some Louis.
My mask off, so everybody let me know if you can hear me. I have kind of a quiet voice, so I will try as hard as possible to project. the talk that I have today, and I have a lot of different things on me, but it's a little bit experimental, and I'm looking at connecting some of the topics in my practice and things that I'm interested in for the first time. So I feel like it's composed of a couple of different parts that I'll try to tie together to my practice in the end. And so if anybody has pieces of what I'm talking about that you feel are interesting or you want me to expand on, please feel free to let me know, because I'm always happy to talk about lots of different things, and I have many things that I'm exploring that I might not cover in my talk. But just to give us a little bit of a roadmap for what I'm talking about today, I'm kind of interested in how a simple material like embroidery thread and one of the historical embroidery methods like redwork is very helpful in helping me find comfort in the meandering and very varied aspect of my creative process. It kind of gives me something to tether myself to and something to understand how different parts of creativity are connected. And so I'm going to give myself a little bit of time to talk about what I feel like embroidery thread can represent broadly, talk more in depth about the process of redwork embroidery, and then connect why that's relevant to my art practice. It's kind of a small aspect of something that I feel like is a little bit larger and kind of intangible to really articulate completely. So I felt like this was a good opportunity for me to start trying to make these connections in my artwork and share them with others. Before I get started with talking about embroidery thread, and I have some examples and things I can pass around, I wanted to highlight two aspects of my practice that kind of contribute to me feeling like there are lots of different things that I have to try and track together. The main thing is that my practice explores a bunch of different media and methods for trying to accomplish the same thing. So sometimes I do work with making physical works like embroidery or works on paper. Otherwise, in other times I might engage with making installations or space setting or still lives. So there are lots of different avenues that I feel like I'm engaging with a lot, and they're not always immediately related to one another. And then the second aspect of my practice that I feel like is sometimes hard to connect is the idea that I'm interested in the mundane. I feel like it's a very accessible entry point to large concepts. So what is it about everyday life or experiences or occurrences that are special enough to contribute to a sense of self or a sense of identity or to connect you with your family and ancestors? The mundane is a really great way to approach those topics because it can be anything small. But at the same time, the mundane is complicated because it can be anything. So sometimes I feel overwhelmed in trying to connect those two parts of my practice or other aspects of myself or sense of being. And so I felt like something like embroidery thread and a historical practice that I was exploring might be a good way for me to start working on it. So to get started with embroidery thread, I wanted to introduce a visual example because this is what started my talk in the first place. This is my piece of Sashiko embroidery thread. I work with this piece of thread until it's finished, and it's what I use to make all of my little embroideries and other parts of my process. It's characterized as like a single strand cotton thread. It's non-mercerized, so it's not glossy. It's kind of, I guess, a little bit dull in its presentation in comparison to embroidery floss, which is kind of like one of the conventional embroidery threads. But I feel like it works very well with the type of materials that I use, like natural materials or vintage fabrics, which have also lost some of their sheen over time. And I feel like this embroidery thread is something like my companion. So the materiality of it or how it works with my work is not as important as what happens to it over time when I start working with it. I didn't bring an example of this today, but usually when I take these out and get started with working with embroidery thread, all of the threads come in this very nice rectangular shape, and they're usually linked together by a very aesthetically pleasing little piece of paper packaging. And so each time I start working, I'll take it out of the packaging carefully and I'll cut the paper and I'll find the little link that keeps the embroidery thread together, and I will carefully cut it apart and then start peeling off the thread to work with in my work. And somehow, regardless of what I do, it always ends up looking like this. I know there's a method to keep it organized. I just simply do not do it, and I still don't know why, but this is what I have become accustomed to. And so when I was thinking about the concept of this talk, that kind of messiness was so present in my studio when I kept trying to come up with elements that I felt like it was something that I should explore, because I felt like it was a good example of my creative process itself. So whenever I go through this piece of embroidery thread, regardless of how I started, I will inevitably lose the beginning point of the thread. Sometimes I can refine it, sometimes it tangles itself on other pieces of the thread, so I have to start with the other end, which I may or may not find. And then at other points, I might get frustrated, so I'll just pull a different piece out and cut it, which contributes to the problem of adding more entry points in the thread. And so it just kind of like keeps going like that and going like that until I pick out different pieces of varying lengths and finish this little tangled thing that I will inevitably mess up another one immediately after. The embroidery thread also leaves a lot of remnants all over my studio that I can never fully capture despite all of my best efforts. So even when I'm finished with a project, I'll find a tiny piece of thread in my hair or on my clothes or in my car or somewhere else. And there's actually one right there on the floor that I noticed before I left. So that's kind of like my relationship with this thread. And it's also my relationship with the artwork that I make. Because I'm exploring so many different things and because the mundane can be anything, I feel like I'm constantly pulling at different entry points to one singular concept. And before I thought about embroidery thread, I didn't necessarily feel like I had as much confidence to be able to connect them to one another. A lot of times I might think about collecting a physical object. Other times I might think about a specific memory that I have, or a journal entry that I might be working on multiple times, or a set of family memories, and they're all too separate from one another for them to be immediately related. I can recognize that they're part of my practice, but when I think about it in a thread-like context, I feel a little bit more comfortable, because all of my embroidery threads, which are used to make embroideries or to test out materials or to mend things, tend to gather within the same sense of self or the same sense of work. And so it gave me a bit more confidence in terms of my own practice in understanding that these things can exist in different spaces. They might be short or long or just exist as remnants, but they're all technically part of the same singular thread. And so I felt like that was a great thing to recognize for myself when I was starting with this project and when I was thinking about this talk, because it also allowed me to examine other aspects of my practice, including historical research and collecting, which is something that I've done for a while and something I'm about to transition into talking to as being relevant to my work rather than something that sits on the outside. And so to make that transition, I'm going to talk a little bit about redwork embroidery specifically, kind of give a bit of background on why it's relevant and important to me, and then get started into thinking about what that means for my art practice. And so I'm going to get started first by passing around these kind of janky visuals. I didn't do a great job at taking the screenshots of these, but these are examples of redwork embroidery that you can pass around. And they're actually all, the reason why I printed them instead of projecting them is that they're pulled from like secondhand sites like eBay and Etsy, where lots of collectors are trying to offload their stock. And so that's kind of something that I'm referencing and I'm about to describe, but I thought it would be good to have a visual example of what redwork embroidery is. And so redwork embroidery is an American craft embroidering technique that was extremely popular from the mid-19th century to the early 20th century. I think we can think about that as being like maybe the 1850s-ish to around the mid-1920s or 1930s. I have an example of some work that's from the 1930s. That's kind of like around when it was popular, and it continued to be popular until machine-made embroidery could replace handmade embroidery. There were lots of different things that I feel like contributed to the importance of redwork embroidery in this specific time period, but from what I was reading and what I could pull out, I think that one of the things that was important was that it was accessible. The thread was machine made, so it wasn't as expensive. The color of the thread, this is not the type of thread, by the way, I'm just using this as a visual example, was called turkey red. It was a cotton embroidery thread, and it was one of the only colors, or the only color, that was color fast, so it wouldn't bleed when it was exposed to water. And that made the materials that they use more likely to be usable, or things that could be washed, because you didn't have to preserve the integrity of this thread that couldn't be kind of like washed, rinsed, and used multiple times. Redwork embroidery was primarily done through patterns. So if you look at those examples that are being passed around, there were iron-on and I believe stamp-on patterns that existed at this time that were relatively cheap to access. And so lots of people could buy them, apply them to their piece of fabric, and then start working with them. And then redwork embroidery is also pretty simple. So I have some examples that I'm going to start passing around while these are going, where I use backstitch, which is one of the popular methods for embroidery, which kind of like is an outline stitch. You can pass this around. This is also backstitch, and you can kind of see it a little bit more clearly given the and then there are a bunch of tiny things if you guys want to come up and take a look after. But these stitches were really straightforward. I think stem stitch, which I don't use, they're pretty simple and easy to learn. And so it was something that could be taught to children or people who were just learning embroidery at the first time. A lot of times this kind of embroidery was taught to young girls, and it was considered more of a feminine activity or a feminine hobby. And it also provided women with an opportunity to make an income outside of the home. So there were lots of different factors as to why redwork embroidery was happening and why it was popular. There are some additional things that I find to be interesting broadly, which is where I started to think about its connection to my own artwork. But it took me a little while to get there. And so that's where I wanted to think about what makes up these embroidery subjects and why they were so interesting. So redwork embroidery was often applied to household items. So things like pillowcases and dishcloths and quilts, which are really popular and then saw a resurgence multiple times and are still popular now. You can find quilting examples with redwork embroidery everywhere, and that's actually how I got interested in redwork embroidery. A lot of times the motifs that were used in redwork embroidery, which you can see in the examples, had a direct relationship to the object that they were kind of like embroidered on. So if in one of the examples that's floating around, you can see a pillowcase that has the word good morning on it. Sometimes they might also say good night because it's something you would put on your bed. If you had like a dish towel, you might use water motifs like dripping water or little faucets because that would be something that you use to clean up water. And then generally there were a bunch of other mundane topics that you can see throughout all of the examples, like flowers and insects and different types of text that might directly describe something that you would put on a quilt or something in your home. And there was something about that that was very interesting to me because it felt like people were working with a vocabulary, even though they were pulling things from patterns. Like there was still an objective that people were working with where they were having a specific use for an item and they wanted to embellish the item with things that would describe it while also being visually interesting. And so that kind of tethered me to redwork embroidery. I felt like it was there's something inherent about embroidery that is very caring to the objects that you have, because you have to modify them by hand in some way. And so all of these household items that had been modified and sit as decorations or might get passed to other people or are made, I think I was looking at this and I couldn't find a great example, but there are even memorial quilts that use redwork embroidery, which have texts or devotions to the people that had passed away. There was something about it that was very interesting and personal, which I felt like resonated with my own artwork, because I'm constantly chasing a sense of identity through regular objects or regular experiences or observations. And so that's kind of like what started to get me into thinking, alongside observing the tangled embroidery thread, that there could be connections to my practice that were coming from other different areas or other different endeavors. And so I kind of sat down and thought about what made my work related to redwork embroidery, or why I kept looking at these redwork examples, even though I wasn't using the historical patterns or a pattern at all. Sometimes I would just use my figures and think about how they were composed on the specific item itself. And so I knew that they were visually interesting. There was something about the bright red thread on a simple piece of fabric or a simple household object. I liked the fact that they were in some way kind of entry-level embroideries. So for somebody like me who was just learning embroidery because I needed a specific outlet for something that would help me, I was really stressed when I discovered embroidery, it would kind of help me have a concentrated practice without ruminating. That was an accessible entry point. And then I was very interested in the mundane subject matter, because even if my work was just figures, there was some kind of relationship to the fact that it was daily life that was being represented. But there was also an interest in considering what redwork embroidery meant as a vocabulary and a cultural practice for people for so many years, that made me consider that I might have a vocabulary that I was working with in my artwork as well. So I decided that I would take a look at some of the common themes that I was exploring within my artwork over the past year when I was exposed to embroidery, and try to determine whether or not there were some similarities. After I looked at a few things, I came to the conclusion that for at least a year and maybe longer, I've been working with, and I don't have the photograph with me because it's kind of fragile, an image from my childhood home in the Caribbean, Burley House. I think some of you all might have heard me talk about Burley House before, but it's basically a generational family home in Tobago that belonged to my dad's family for multiple generations. The house is threatened by coastal erosion, so it's no longer livable, and there's a very realistic threat that it might collapse. It's no longer structurally sound. The picture that we have of Burley House exists when it was kind of in its prime, and you can see it like freshly restored and up to date in the 60s and 70s with all of the new like panel flooring and lots of conventions of the household in the background of the image. And something about that picture allowed me to connect different materials in my artwork, like understand what I was working with. Because as I went through the doilies that I was collecting, or the interest in embroidery, or some of the conventions of everyday life that I would explore in my work, I would find examples from Burley House, from my own childhood, and from that image, and also things that connected me to my ancestors. So there are lots of materials in the picture where you can see there are doilies draped on the back of the chair, or curtains that have a very similar material texture to what I keep trying to find in handkerchiefs. There are tons of images in books that we were able to read as kids that are still lined up in the back of the photo, or other types of like basic household conventions that I remembered interacting with and were informing my artwork. And so as I was recognizing that set of memory and the fact that I'd been engaging for it for a long time, I was able to recognize the fact that I was most likely building some form of visual convention on my own, in the same way that there's some kind of cultural convention of redwork embroidery, maybe in a broader sense for multiple people. There were a bunch of forms that I would return to regularly, so you might see similar gestures in the figures that I work with. There were lots of different materials that I felt like were appropriate to embroider on because they reminded me of home. And there were lots of different objects that I felt comfortable collecting, or historical eras that I might be more likely to investigate in research as background for my art practice, all because I'm trying to work with the same sense of convention. And so I think that those are somewhat of my own patterns that I work with in embroidery and my patterns that I work with in drawing, and then broadly the sense of self that I'm able to create in my art practice, even if it's very muddled or it's multifaceted. They're all being connected in some way by a singular concept, a lot like that piece of thread that I'm working with in my work. So kind of as a conclusion, I feel like I recognize that my practice is a lot of things. It can be installation, or it can be space setting. It goes through embroidery, and it covers a lot of topics. And a lot of the time, they meander for the most part of my practice. So they're never directly related to one another. They'll take a bunch of different detours. Sometimes I might realistically forget about them for a few years and then come back to them later on. So they can really be anything I want them to be, but with the comfort of that piece of thread, or like the sense of embroidery thread, and all of the historical options that I have available to me to start researching, it does give me a sense of comfort that my practice does connect to multiple areas and to one another, and that it's okay for me to explore different things because they all will connect at some point in the end. So that's what I'm working with. Thank you for listening.
Does anyone have any questions?
So, hello. Thank you for your talk. Okay, of course. So I was wondering if you could tie a thread between your embroidery work and your the work that you do through film and through movement, and I was wondering if there's a thread that ties that all together, or maybe not.
I'm glad that you asked. I think there is a thread between them. So a lot of the video work that I started working with came from the fact that I wanted to interact in some way with the objects that I was collecting, and with a studio practice, or like building a sense of comfort even in kind of like non-permanent spaces. So I started making videos when I didn't know whether or not I would have a studio space, and I would be able to set things up periodically and engage with them as like some kind of memory of moving through a space, and then clean them up and move on later. And I think it kind of was a way for me to put a bunch of things that I liked and was interested in one place, even if I couldn't put them there for a long time. So it's kind of like the installation aspect of my practice. And I feel like the embroidery covers a lot of the gestures that I might explore in the spaces over time, because they're kind of like the repetition of common gestures within a space.
Yeah, thank you.
So you talked about like object practice and collecting, and as a fellow object fiend, can you talk more about that? Like what kinds of objects, what does collecting mean to you, etc.?
Sure, yes. So I have things that I brought with me that I'm glad that somebody asked, because I don't mind sharing. So I collect a lot of household objects. That's part of why I think redwork embroidery was so interesting to me, because usually they're like material objects like handkerchiefs and doilies, and this is giving me a chance to show off some new things that I collected. So these are some antique handkerchiefs from a while back. They include some cutwork embroidery, and feel free to come up here and take a closer look, which I think was done by hand. This is a really great example of cutwork embroidery, or like whitework embroidery that was done by hand. And so I think this is like really sending me into a tangent. So if anybody feels like I'm talking for too long, just let me know. But there was a paper I believe I was reading once about women in the household. It was specifically about Caribbean women, and the fact that a lot of women would collect or covet household items, and they ended up being these collectors of culture, like decorative arts culture, unintentionally, because a lot of women's interests were not necessarily considered to be valid or viable, besides having trinkets or objects that they were interested in. And I feel like that there's something interesting about collecting household objects specifically because they're so mundane, but there is a lot of care that is put into their creation, and there's a lot of care that comes with holding on to them. So you'll see people that have like the china cabinets. It's common with Caribbean people, but I know it's common with other cultures too, where people have those like nice little pieces that you cannot touch and you just have to look at, or silver collections or couches, like anything like that. I feel like there's something that's very interesting about the compulsion to collect and maintain beautiful objects that are theoretically used for everyday life. And so in my collections, these hankies probably should have been used at some point for people, but for me, I just kind of hold on to them as memories instead. I also have a quilt. You can ask more questions that I just got from Dawn at McGuffey Art Center. She's my studio neighbor. This is a great example of something that relates to redwork embroidery a little bit, but it's blue work. You can see the little patterns. There's a good morning text on it, which is similar to the conventions of redwork embroidery, and then just random scenes. So if you want to take a closer look, please feel free. That's kind of like a very light introduction to my interest in collecting. I can always talk about it more.
I will be bending your ear.
That sounds great. I'm happy to talk about it. Any other questions?
Are you doing anything contemporary with redwork?
I think so. So, well, maybe. When I think about my redwork embroidery, I guess it would inherently be contemporary because it's not working with any of the original patterns, and it's working with art images. So these kind of gestures that I develop are part of my sketching practice. They're related to my contemporary gestures or personal practice. And so even if I replicate them multiple times, technically they're original, and then they engage with being contemporary artworks rather than trying to maintain the conventions of redwork embroidery. I think there is a huge connection because of the materials that I choose to use, so there's always that kind of link to the original practice.
My second question is, I'm a fiber artist, so I will preach the gospel of grounded and centeredness in working with cloth and fiber and thread and yarn.
Yeah.
But can you talk about how that changed you?
I think so. I'm glad that you asked about that. So I kind of mentioned that super briefly in what I was talking about, which is that I turned to embroidery when I was a little bit emotionally distressed, like within a really hard year, and I was looking for something that was tactile, and I feel like that was a very interesting part of working with fiber, because not only is it tangible, like you always have to have a hold on the material that you're working with, but it's also very methodical, and it doesn't allow for a lot of rumination. So you can talk to people or you can consume media, but at the same time you're dedicated to a specific task that contains like your movement and your vision and your sense of touch. And I feel like something about that to me is very grounding and therapeutic. Like you always have access to something that is tethering you to the world in person. Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Yes. Oh, I saw it too. Okay. Yeah.
So I'm interested in your process. Like, do you draw ahead of time? Is it freehand? Are you using other images that you trace? And then and do you use like a frame to stretch the fabric, or do you do free?
Yeah.
And then the last question is have you shown these anywhere? Have you exhibited these?
Yes, I'm glad you asked about all of those. So I started doing works on paper, and I still do. And so all of these little gestures are the same gestures that you'll find in a lot of the works on paper that I do. So generally, it's like a multi-step process. I may or may not do a rough sketch of some gestures that I can see based on myself, with like just kind of like a head and a body. Then I'll take a photo of myself, then I'll do a sketch from the photo, and then I will cover it with a piece of tracing paper and distill the figure into something that's kind of simplified. And then it's easy to transfer onto fabric because you can use a light box. You can also use a window, which is not recommended, or something. So it's like pretty accessible. And I'll stretch it on an embroidery hoop and just start going. So it's kind of like not very complicated, and I really just use super simple things like my phone. And I'm glad you asked about showing them, because I'm in the Small Work show tonight at Le Udemont, which is out, I don't know how to describe where it is in Charlottesville. I tried. Tori also has works in that show tonight too. So that's where some of these works are up. I also got to show them at the Black Arts Collective, of which Corey is a founding member, and Tori is a founding member, so it's a fun connection. Question?
Okay, I'm going to try to get to my question in a sort of roundabout way, but thank you so much for your beautiful talk. Oh, it's so, I just feel like you're just going right through my ears, into my heart, and it just warms me so much. So the mundane and the tethering is just so powerful for me right now to hear that, and just how beautiful that is. Even my walk through downtown, the mall to get here, it was so quiet. I was like, am I in a street in Europe? And oh, look, there are birds up there. I don't ever notice this kind of stuff. It just felt so beautifully mundane. And when your stuff comes around here, it feels like it's just got it's got energy in it that is just, we just hold it up and my hands feel like they're shaking a little bit because it's so beautiful and a gift. So I was a crocheter. I mean, I still know how to crochet. And my old girlfriend and I, many years ago, started crocheting hats for people in Colorado and Vail and Aspen. And we would make these based on patterns from Guatemala, where we had been. And I felt okay to do that because I noticed the men in Guatemala were making bags, and they're like, oh, guys can crochet? Okay, this is okay. Yeah. So we would make hats, and then we would sell them to people, custom hats, and then we ended up in Europe, and we would make these hats, and some friend said, okay, we were in Antwerp, and they said, just put them out in a blanket, and you'll sell them. And we put them out in a blanket, and we would sell, like, out of 30, we would sell 2, and the one those 2 were the ugliest, I thought. And we were like, oh, so this is the ones, that were just so sort of, we didn't think were going to work. And then somebody just snatched them up. They were perfect for someone. And so I guess one of my questions is, but I'll stop here, is do you have pieces that you sort of love that someone might look at and just go, huh? But to you, they just like get to your heart?
I think so. I feel like this is a super interesting question because I might consider, this is one of the things that I'm tentatively exploring. The fact that making these figures is something like mark making to me, almost like drawing or like encountering them very regularly. And so in some way, and I'm not 100% sure, I might be a little bit more interested in the process of making the figure rather than the final work itself. And so I think I'm comfortable with what they look like, and I feel attached to them because I make them, but I don't have any idea or concept of what people think of them at all. And I only know about them in context of like a historical convention or something like that. And so it's something I'm still working through, is understanding what I feel like the works actually look like and why I like them. So I think I'm more personally engaged with them as objects, and I don't sell them very frequently because I just hold on to them instead. So that's kind of something that I feel like is interesting to think about. Thank you for asking.
I noticed in the works that you passed around the very fluid, rounded nature of the figures, and you choose to apply a structure of the numbering system. And I was curious to hear your thoughts around, do you always add that cardinality or adding the numbering system to your work?
Yeah, the numbering system is, I guess, arbitrary, to be honest. Like, I always number them, and theoretically I will number them based on when I apply them to the fabric. So like in whatever order I applied them, I'll number them like 1 through 5. But there are multiple 1 through 5s in a bunch of different works. Like this one has numbers, and then a bunch of the other ones that went around also have numbers. So they're not related to the figures specifically or anything else. I think it's kind of a holdout to something I did in college where I was doing a lot of like mapping and process-based work. And so I felt connected to the numbers, and I never separated myself from them after I moved on from things like that.
Another kind of tether.
That's like a remnant. Yeah, another tether to past creative practices.
Question. Your figures, because I'm from Mom. Mom's gonna say, because you dance, I'm sitting here now and I'm very proud, of course, and I'm seeing the figures as you as a little girl, and some of your figures, I see them, sometimes I don't, in her studio or at home. And some of the figures look like me when you were little. So I wanted to know if any of your figures that you're drawing and then embroidery, is it from your dances, because you dance a lot and they remind me of you dancing. So is that a part of your figure, or like what's the concept? How do you come up with that particular figure?
Yeah, I feel like that is another tether if we want to talk about that. So I danced for like 20-something years, not pre-professional, just as a practice. And when I was the figures are me for the most part, and they're also interpretations of gestures that I do on a regular basis. When I tried to interpret the gestures from everyday life, I think the dance convention is what is informing why they look the way that they do. So I don't compose an image and put myself into the image to get the gesture. I'll simply perform the gesture myself and then make a drawing based on what I'm performing. So there are no objects I'm engaging with, they're just an interpretation. And so that's why they might have a dance-based convention, because the ways that I know to interpret gestures is probably through dance. There also might be some choreographic elements in arranging the figures, and so I haven't decided whether or not I think that's true. Yeah.
question. Thank you. We talked about textile practice as grounding, and I'm curious how this grounding practice contributes to your sense of place when you speak about ancestors in the Caribbean, which is not the land that we're on now. So how do you connect or tether to this like upper realm through your grounding practice?
Yeah, I think that's a really nice question. I feel like for some reason for me, I engage with that like tactile element a lot. That's what I keep going back to as to why like embroidery or fabric is so relevant. And the tactile element is something that a lot of my family members or ancestors also worked with. So when I think about my dad's mom, my grandma, who I didn't really know that much before she passed away, she also did a lot of sewing and she taught other people sewing and embroidery. It wasn't an exploratory process, it was practical because a lot of the girls that she was teaching were going into being domestic workers, which was common for Caribbean women. So there's that kind of tactile tether that's literal, but then there's also a relationship to ancestors broadly because of the fact that the gestures that I'm exploring in these materials and putting onto pieces of fabric or engaging with through a specific process are things that aren't inherently unique to me, but things that I know my ancestors and family members did on a regular basis. So the same way that I might want to embroider and think about, you know, why I like folding laundry or why I like, you know, making a specific meal that could be made by somebody else, or why I like looking for things in a garden or like wait for specific flowers to come out in the spring. That's something that I feel like my ancestors probably engaged with too, especially in the Caribbean where there's a lot of wildlife and there's a lot of specific food culture and a lot of people had to perform labor. So all of those types of things and the fact that I can engage with them favorably and choose to put them in embroidery is something that I feel like is kind of grounding and enjoyable to me. That makes sense.
Yes, thank you.
I think that might be a good place to stop so that there's time for people to come up and see the work.